Yom Kippur is a time for real reflection. A year ago, we were reeling from the shooting at the Fifth Third Bank and the horrible attack in Florida, and this year we add Dayton and Texas and how many other places. It no longer feels like these shootings are happening as isolated instances. It feels like after each horrific event, we immediately become polarized about how to respond. Even though all mourn with the victims' families, work to prevent additional problems is frequently thwarted before anything really begins. Sometimes the news cycle moves the national focus to something else, providing a distraction to the issue of prevention of these horrible moments. And yet, this time, this moment seems different. We may finally be at a time for action to make us feel safer and to better prevent these types of shootings. I was recently listening to a story on the radio, about a group that was buying back guns, melting them down, and turning them into gardening tools. Shovels with handles, complete with an olive branch. Can we try and find that now? You saw it earlier, because I put it in the wrong place. Good help. It's hard to find. There, wait, there it is. And in 5 or 10 minutes, it'll be bright enough for you to see it. There it goes. So this is a shovel that was made from a gun. This part here, excuse me, Mr. Springer, this part here was actually thank you for those of you who know what that means, the barrel of the gun. In fact, here it is, right here. Yeah, they were sold out. So, of course, being me, I called them and said, I cannot put a picture on the screen. We need to see one of these. I expected a shovel. And yet, let's see the next slide. That's what's on the handle, the olive branch. This is what a modern religious person thinks about when they think about this phrase, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither will they learn war anymore. This organization takes a gun and they beat it into a plowshare, in this case, a shovel for planting the bulbs, which I always put upside down, and China blooms beautifully every spring. Thank you for those 3 of you who understood what I was saying. Our tradition teaches us that God's goal for God's creation is to live in a world so harmonious that we do not need the tools of war. And while it may be politically expedient to talk about a full and total ban on guns in our society, we would have a very hard time justifying a Jewish justification for a total ban on guns. On the other hand, the situation in which we find ourselves does need to be addressed. If one organization can buy guns and make them into something that promotes life rather than takes it, perhaps we can all come together to decide that rather than taking the side of any political party, we can take the side of Judaism, which values human life above everything else. Judaism teaches us that we are allowed to defend ourselves. We are even allowed to defend ourselves with a gun. If there is imminent danger, that is, if someone is coming at us with the intent to kill us, we are justified in our tradition in taking the assailant's life in favor of our own. Judaism, however, also teaches us that when we are the aggressor in that kind of a situation and death results, we are guilty of murder. According to our tradition, imminent danger and a perceived threat where one is not in immediate physical danger are very different. Some have argued that had Germany not collected all the weapons from German Jews, more might have survived the Holocaust because they could have fought back. But if you think that through, you can understand that that's a pretty difficult argument to make. But additional resistance could have been easier. It would not have been enough to deter Hitler. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was an important moment during the Holocaust, inspiring the hopeless and helpless with their bravery. These young folks were successful only because of the weapons they found and the ingenuity of those resisting. And Israel. Israel has a far greater threat on its borders and its nearby neighborhoods than do we. And yet, the Israelis say that Israelis must meet a detailed list of criteria to be allowed to own a firearm. They must ask the state for a license, are permitted only one gun at a time, and must even ask for permission to sell their gun. And the firearms licensing department is no rubber stamp. Roughly 40% of requests in Israel are rejected. This is from a society where so many serve in the military and are trained in the use of a weapon. We in America embrace a constitution with the Second Amendment, which states, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." It is true that I wish people quoted Torah as often as they seem to quote the Constitution, but my understanding of this phrase required us to talk about the types of arms we have the right to bear. My understanding of Judaism does not refute the right to bear arms, but seeks a world where we rarely need them. Assault weapons, rifles used by the military, and other weapons of war are far more powerful and deadly than we need for self-defense. Weapons that can kill many in seconds may be fun at the shooting range or other controlled place, but they have no place outside of military or law enforcement. And they certainly should not be easily obtained by anyone, especially people who might use them during a fit of rage. As Judaism evolved, so too has our understanding of time-honored themes and values. We know, for example, the phrases from Leviticus, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. We know that certain transgressions in the Bible are punishable by death. However, the Talmud, written hundreds of years after the Bible, determines that there should be profound reluctance for the use of capital punishment. In fact, one passage even says, and I quote, "The Sanhedrin, or rabbinic court that puts to death one person in 7 years is called tyrannical." Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says one person in 70 years. Even though the possibility of the death penalty still remains law, the prevailing understanding in our tradition is that it should be rarely used. As of today, Adolf Eichmann, may his name be blotted out, was the only person put to death by the death penalty in civil court in Israel, and that was in 1962. It is the same argument that should be made for the way we think about guns. Just because we can own a gun doesn't mean we should own all types of guns. When President Reagan was shot, Press Secretary James Brady was also shot with an inability to fully recover. His wife Sarah was a champion for firearm control, and the Brady bill introduced background checks. The federal assault weapons ban expired in 2004. Most years since that legislation expired, the number of deaths in the United States from mass shootings was higher, and in some cases far higher than when the ban was in place. After 10 years, the law was allowed to expire, and attempts to renew it were not successful. That doesn't mean that a majority of the country didn't want these laws renewed. It means that politics didn't allow for it. The constitutional right to bear arms was protected during both the Brady Bill and the assault weapons ban, but it made it much more difficult for the wrong people to buy a weapon and kept certain inappropriate weapons off the market. When we buy a car, you and I pay for the title and the license and all kinds of other things. But this is not always the case with a gun. But today is not the day to convince you that there are inconsistencies with our laws regarding guns. It is understandable that we are restricted in the use of our cars. It is instructive that the death penalty is supposed to be used legally and only rarely. And it is unjustifiable that a country that values life will not figure out how to safely allow, regulate, and control gun ownership for the appropriate purpose of self-defense. We should be embarrassed that a country with the remarkable innovations and ingenuity that are so easily found here cannot seem to bring a safer and less frightening way for all to legally bear arms. And the truth is, it is not the time for me to endorse any particular legislation tonight. It's not necessary that I do that from here. Rather, that I'm praying that all of you are like me and have had enough of story after story telling of a synagogue shooting or a Walmart parking lot shooting or a Dayton Saturday night shooting or a shooting at the Las Vegas Music Festival or a bank lobby shooting, and on and on and on. People who should not have guns have them. It is no one's right to use a firearm to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time for any reason. Killing the person who is about to kill you is one thing, but Sandy Hook Elementary School, Stoneman Douglas High School, Tree of Life Synagogue, we have to implore our lawmakers to demonstrably enforce existing laws and pass additional laws that fill in the gaps that meaningfully decrease the availability and use of firearm types that have no place in our society other than for law enforcement and military. Let's start there. We have to agree, all of us, that the right to bear arms as is if Torah Sinai, given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And also we have to agree that living with that right in safety and in sanity is vital to our society. If the right to bear arms is more important than the lives the right was designed to protect, then it is time to readjust our thinking. A year and a half ago, a sizable group of Cincinnati high school Jewish teens initiated a grant through the Jewish Foundation's Youth Collective to rent transportation and opened an online GoFundMe account for a rally, for their participation in a rally in Columbus to demand of lawmakers there better gun laws. And these kids have not let that issue go, and neither should we. We are not going to disarm this country, but maybe we can make the way we are armed safer and more reasonable. A youth group student wanted to create a laser tag activity for the youth group. It seems to come up every couple of years, but this one year, there was more creativity in the request. So for those of you who don't know, laser tag is where you run around in a dark space and shoot at people, and their vest lights up and they're dead. But not really dead, they're just out. My response was, sorry, but we are going to find other community building activities that don't require us to shoot each other. Thanks anyway. And then the student said, what if we do a program on the Arab-Israeli conflict? And half of us are Arabs and the other half are Israelis. Now, I'm not sure that that student really had thought that through, but while they got a few points for the creative manipulation of my values to have a youth group educational program on Israel, it was precisely that mentality that I was not interested in promoting. It is true that our Bible has many examples of conquering others and God's wrath ending with the death of the sinner. But it also has many examples which remind us that we are our brother's keeper. Thou shalt not murder, and love our neighbors as ourselves. The Bible teaches us that evil and murder exist. But I believe at the Torah's very core that we are demanded to seek peace, justice, and value life over everything. Some are worried that if additional gun laws are passed, there may be a slippery slope toward repealing the right to bear arms altogether. While this has been a successful strategy to limit other rights once thought too limitless, this core constitutional value really has no chance of being repealed. And if we can create a safer society where guns are only used as self-defense and never available to those who shouldn't have them, however that is determined, then the call for gun control will wane because guns will no longer be misused. Let us not take this moment of fear and transform it into a moment of partisanship. Let's take this opportunity to consider all that we have lost and work to gain as much of it back as we can. Those who hope to make this a partisan issue don't understand the real fear, the real sense of danger and insecurity, and the relentless mourning among our kids, our temple members, and so many others. There has to be a way for politicians to do what is needed to create a greater sense of security. There has to be a way for all of us to realize that the right to bear arms does not include the types of weapons used in so many of these mass shootings. Neither the NRA nor the anti-gun lobby should be the ones our elected officials are listening to. It should be us, all of us. It should be our kids. And they've made their voices clear and loud, and they should keep going. And our Judaism reminds us that while we are within our rights to defend ourselves, the ultimate goal is to beat swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks and give me the chance to buy the most overpriced, wonderful tool to dig up the ground. On this Yom Kippur, one of the things I am atoning for is not using my voice, my checkbook, and my vote strongly enough to insist that enough is enough. Some things don't fit nicely into a partisan platform pitting us against each other. Sometimes the right thing to do emerges because the current situation is so out of control that allowing nothing to change is itself a sin. That is this moment. That is the moment in which we find ourselves tonight. I hope you will join me in figuring out ways to insist that these weapons find their way to be made into gardening tools and not to be used for the statement of an evil or ill person who advances no cause but rather makes widows and widowers, force mothers to weep over their children's graves, and allow people to die senseless deaths because we didn't have the courage to do what is right. It is time that things change. It is not partisan. The details have to be worked out, to be sure. So let's work them out. But let us also resolve to not let the moment pass without insisting on a safer future, if not for us, then for our children. And if not now, when? If not now, when? Amen.